pass it here over. So the plan for today, I'm going to go through some of the theoretics from Marx and Engels about what constitutes class, how we understand it. Then I'm going to talk a bit about what the consequences of this are. I'm then going to go on to talk about class consciousness itself and how this can be achieved. I'm then going to move over to some theory from Antonio Gramsci, who was a leader of the Italian Communist Party, and his famous theory of cultural hegemony. Just a little bit about who he was and what his theory was. I'm then going to put that into practice with a little bit about the media, who owns the media, what do the headlines say, a little bit about social media and advertising, before finally asking the question, I guess, does the media actually effectively counteract class consciousness? Basically, who wins in this conflict? And then I'll sum up with some conclusions at the end of the talk. Okay, nice. So essentially, class is seen as a dialectic relationship between two groups in society with opposing material interests. So Engels describes basically the most prominent form of the dialectic relationship as being the law of unity and conflict of opposites. So if you imagine, in this case, a ruling elite and an oppressed class that have constantly differing material interests, an oppressed class can unite to overcome in conflict against their opposition. They then create in themselves new forms of exploitation, which in turn creates more resistance to them. So this summed up in the first line of the Communist Manifesto. It's that important to Marx. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So obviously under capitalism, we see that this struggle is between those who own property and those who work to create profit for them, so the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are able to make profit simply from the labour of the proletarians that they exploit. They therefore do not have any need to labour in themselves. They simply depend on their property to make money, whereas the proletariat live only by their labour. They're forced by circumstance to sell their labour power to the capitalists for a few hours a day. As Marx describes this in Wage, Labour and Capital, this is the sacrifice of the worker's life. Essentially, he becomes a slave for a few hours a day whilst he produces for the capitalist and for their profit. Thanks. So, as we see this function in capitalist economy, perhaps Marx's most famous equation is about his circuit of capital. So we see M, which is the capital that the capitalist puts in. He uses this to buy commodities, which are the means of production. So that's to buy a factory, to buy the machines and things that produce, and labour power, which is what the proletariat has to offer to the process, and that then creates new commodities, which the capitalist is then able to sell for a profit. And the exploitation here occurs when the surplus value of the workers is accumulated by the capitalist in order to produce profit. So an example of this is if I were to make handmade chairs for a company, I could make, say, 8 chairs in an 8-hour day, which is quite quick chair making, but still. Each chair would be sold on the market for £20. Wooden tools, which is referred to as constant capital, would cost £5 for the making of each chair, and my wage would be £5 an hour. As you can see, the only value attributed to the chair comes from the raw materials and what's needed to produce it, and from my labour. But suddenly, £10 of this has disappeared into the pockets of the capitalist. Okay. So now we see the consequences of orienting society in this way. So the capitalists, who are often described by Marx as capital personified, are forced really to act in the interests of capitalists. To not act in the interests of capital is to invite competition that will essentially defeat them. And if this happens, they run the risk of being proletarianized, which is the worst case scenario for a capitalist. So they have to produce for exchange of profit. They don't really have any choice. But the social consequences of all these actions taken in pursuit of profit are only really felt by the proletariat, then there's a negligible effect on the bourgeoisie. So we see pollution, environmental damage, homelessness, poverty, all this kind of unstable labour, things like that. For example, this came out a couple of weeks ago. It was found that about 40,000 deaths per year can be attributed to air pollution in the UK. So obviously this is the fact that it would be costly to the bourgeois, it would undermine their profit if they were to implement things that would reduce the emissions. This is actually, I think, the highest levels of any Western country in the world. We then obviously see the effects of global warming. We've seen recently with Hurricane Irma, for example. It was Al Gore said back in 2000 that he expected global warming to produce much larger hurricanes and other storms and things, and he was pretty much laughed at. And now, of course, we see that this is quite clearly the case. We've also seen a massive rise in homelessness in the UK since 2010, and we've seen more and more unstable labour coming in with things like zero-hour contracts, and of course we've also seen with the massive rise of homelessness in the UK. There was also the foreclosure crisis in America, where millions of people over a matter of months were chucked out of their homes because they're unable to afford to pay back mortgages and things. We then also see that the capitalist economy, because of this class division, is fundamentally unstable, which is why we see quite frequent and in some cases quite massive economic crashes. This is because the more profit that is made by the capitalist, the less consumption power the workers have, the less they have to spend to buy back the products that they produced, and this means that the worker doesn't have enough money to buy what he needs to survive, and the money isn't then taken back into the corporations and things which are producing things. So there's a crash all over and complete stagnation essentially of production. So a good example of this obviously is the 2008 crisis, which really has its roots back in the 1970s, which was a time when with advances and things in technology, there was suddenly a mass movement from the capitalists to having labour basically shipped across seas and things. This kind of the start of globalization, and with that we saw a stagnation in the wages of working people in the West, at the same time as inflation and increasing prices. And in order to deal with that, the capitalist community basically found that credit was the only way in which they could keep the economy running. So you saw absolutely masses of debt being incurred by families in the US and the UK. I think it's about 55,000 per household or something like that in the UK today, pounds worth of debt, which completely destabilised the economy. The majority of money in our economy at the moment is debt. It's not actually real money. So we also see that the bourgeoisie, as I'll come on to later, has a certain level of control over the ideas and norms, but this through control of media, as I'll come on to a bit later. Next. Okay, so this is a specific case study to show the consequence of class distinctions. So in Flint, Michigan, Governor Snyder was elected in 2011, promising major tax cuts to big corporations such as General Motors from Detroit. So in order to save money, as you have to cut the public expenditure in order to pay for these tax cuts, they saved $15 million by switching the water supply from Detroit, which is where it had come from, to the Flint River, which caused massive outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease. And this went on for months, so people complained about it for months and nothing was done for ages. But when General Motors complained about it, within a couple of weeks, they complained about it because the water was eroding parts of the car parts as they were trying to build cars. the governor suddenly stepped in to aid them out, spending $440,000 to ensure that they were able to keep making profit, essentially. And we saw that one of the poorest cities in the US, all of the houses and things became essentially worthless. So people who'd worked their entire lives just to have a place to live and to own a house to live in, suddenly it was all gone, and you couldn't even sell your house to move away somewhere else. And 15 people died as a direct result of the Legionnaires' disease that broke out. And other people are predicted to live considerably shortened lives as a result as well. So, based on this, what is class consciousness and how are we able to achieve it? The term actually isn't used by Marx himself. He makes a distinction between a class in itself, which is a class that is acting in a way in which is necessary, I guess, to the functioning of the capitalist economy, and a class for itself, which I guess is one that is able to realise its class interests and act in those interests. Obviously, we see those interests eventually being culminating in a better way of organising society, as we see it, socialism. But there's other interests as well, just simply raising your wage or something. So it's also the realisation of the exploitation of the proletariat to an extent. It doesn't have to be to the extent that we know that all profit is exploitation, but just to the extent that people know they're being taken for a ride, I guess. So this can be achieved, well, it essentially comes from the experience of being an exploited proletarian is kind of the basis of where class consciousness comes from, but it's made a lot stronger when you're able to form collective groups, such as trade unions and things, and realise the potential to change the effect that you can have by unionising and coming together. And it can be aided through the spread of revolutionary ideas, such as media and newspapers that we produce ourselves, like the Socialist Appeal, which you're welcome to buy at any point today. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about Antonio Gramsci and his theory of cultural hegemony. So a little bit of background about who Gramsci was. Gramsci was born in Sardinia in Italy, and was one of the founding members of the Italian Communist Party, which was founded in Livorno in northern Italy in 1921. As one of the major opposition to Mussolini's government, he was imprisoned by the government in 1926, which is where he wrote his prison notebooks with contributions to many different areas of Marxist thought, so philosophy, history, and of course his most prominent theory, the theory of cultural hegemony. And he spent 11 years in prison before he finally died from his steadily deteriorating medical conditions. So, when coming to the theory of cultural hegemony, he essentially begged the question as to why there were no successful revolutions in Italy and Germany, places where it appeared as though the material conditions were right to have a revolution. There was enough class conflict, and there was enough organisation, I guess, also of the proletariat to see a revolution like obviously was seen in Russia in October of 1917. So he saw that obviously in order to maintain profits, the ruling class has an interest in maintaining the stability of the capitalist system as it is, but he rejected the idea that people can have a false consciousness. He believed that everyone acts in their class interests, but the bourgeoisie acts in a way as to kind of manipulate people so that they see some interests as more important than other interests. For example, immigrants coming over and diluting the labour market, meaning that your wage goes down. This is seen as something that is a fault of immigrants coming in. So it basically it justifies the status quo and then creates the idea of another or an outsider who's coming in to ruin it, rather than seeing the system itself as a problem. And the bourgeoisie preaches the inevitability and naturality of current social conditions. I think this is one of the main arguments we hear from capitalists, is that it's human nature to act in this way. Obviously, it wasn't realised until the 16th century or so, but it's always been there. And this comes mainly as of course the topic of the talk, through the role of the media, so newspapers, television, social media, and so forth. But it also comes through the way in which government acts. So, for example, our education system really prioritises competitiveness as a trait that pupils should have. So we have things like league tables and things in schools, really driving people's, I guess, employability, ability to come straight from school and into the labour market, rather than actually focusing on developing people's intellects and their ability to think analytically and critically. And we've seen very recently a focus on, I have no idea what they mean by British values, but on British values in primary schools. Right, so now that we have the kind of theoretical framework, I'm going to go on to talk about the real-world implications of media. So, so if the theory of Antonio Gramsci is correct, and we can see the media really is playing this role in shaping the ideas of working class people and as a tool of bourgeoisie, then we would see that the media would be primarily owned by very, very few wealthy individuals. And this is exactly what we see, as a report by the Media Reform Coalition found. 80% of all local newspapers in the UK is owned by only 6 companies. Nearly 60% of the circulating newspapers in the UK are owned, like the national ones, are owned by only 2 companies, which is Murdoch's News Corp and Lord Rothermere's Daily Mail Group. And Google is used for 90% of all online searches in the UK. In fact, Robert Epstein from the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology claimed that through the search engine manipulation effect, Google had the power actually to affect the outcome of elections simply through, as we see here, if you were, say, to type in climate change into Google, the results you get might affect the views that you take on things, and these are dominated by views that are predominantly anti-left wing, such as seeing climate change as fake, seeing communists as not being human, and seeing business as booming, as incredibly successful, when it really isn't. So now a little look about what the headlines of newspapers are saying and why they're saying it. So we see quite a negative view, obviously, given about immigrants, and we often see in quite a clever way the way in which the media covers this, is that it focuses in on issues that are very important to people, and it sees the immigrants as somehow undermining this. So, for example, we see in this one and the far one over there, immigrants taking all new jobs in Britain. So we see things about housing as well, and what's the other one? Oh yeah, we also see, strangely enough, this becoming a gendered issue as well with Soft Touch Britain. The idea that somehow it's feminine to be caring and nurturing and allowing immigrants in, and we've got to, if we're going to give the impression that we're a strong country that knows how to deal with things, we have to give off this masculine image of keeping all immigrants out and not allowing them to damage our cultural fabric, essentially, of the nation. And we also see this recently with well, not just recently, but with pretty much all left-wing protest groups. We see not exactly lies, but distortions of the truth that really focus in on particular acts of violence and things that are actually only a small part of what's going on in the process. And these are what you see in the headlines after an attack about this. So this was this was demonstration in Berkeley, in I think it's near San Francisco in California. So there were about 7,000 or so people protesting in this, and the focus, obviously, of all the headlines isn't what the protests were doing, what was the protest about. It's about the fact that 5 people were hurt and 13 people subsequently arrested in a minor skirmish in the middle of this, of this protest. And so we see quite clearly that there's this act by the media to kind of challenge any groups that kind of try to challenge the current status quo, the current constitution of the state, I guess. So we often hear that social media is kind of seen as a platform for people to kind of spread ideas. It's seen as kind of a neutral force. But actually, in reality, we see that social media companies like Facebook and like Twitter actually make a huge amount of money through advertising. So people upload, obviously, information about ourselves, what are our hobbies, what are our main interests and such, and these are sold on to companies so that they can use targeted advertisements and things. And this was actually used by a group called Aggregate IQ and Cambridge Analytica in trying to affect people's ideas about the upcoming referendum on Brexit. It was also used for the Trump election, and actually Steve Bannon, who was a leading member in Trump's cabinet, was at one point, I think it was of Aggregate IQ, he was head of. And we also see that the bourgeoisie is able to approach us through advertising. Where approximately we see about 5,000 adverts every single day, and these adverts are able to affect people in a number of ways. The first way is what they want to make obvious to you, is simply brand awareness. But they also give incredibly fake details about product quality, things like that. You often see doctored images and things, and Photoshop and things like that when you're looking at food companies or something that give a fake image of what you're buying. They also seek to forge associations in your brain. So companies like McDonald's and KFC and things often have incredibly bright images, colours and things on their adverts, so that you associate the bright colour with the company. And there's an advert that really gets me. That's the Trivago advert, if anyone knows it, where you have the word hotel and all of the letters flip over and become Trivago. And I always, whenever I'm thinking about a hotel, immediately jump to thinking about Trivago, though I've never used them and have no idea if they're actually any good. It's the way in which they're able to forge these associations in your brain. It also seeks to normalise market economy. All we see on TV is this kind of exchange process of purchasing and selling, and this kind of becomes seen as kind of a societal norm for people. And another major negative effect of advertising is that they massively drive up the price of goods. If you think that if you were to buy something in Aldi or in Tesco's, a kind of own brand one, the quality is normally incredibly similar to something that you buy that's branded, and the reason that that's so expensive is because they spend a hell of a lot of money on these advertising campaigns. So, in the way that the media act on behalf of the bourgeoisie, does this actually counteract class consciousness that we see? Well, we've seen recently that there's a lot of ways in which there's actually been a counter movement against this. So we've seen recently the success of the Corbyn campaign, which got 40% of the vote, which I think he got more votes than Tony Blair got in 2 of the 3 times in which he was elected, which is quite astounding. And that's despite a massive media protest against him, where he was displayed as someone who was a weak leader, someone who was a terrorist sympathiser. And then, of course, we see that when Theresa May's elected, she's exactly the same as the way in which they tried to portray Jeremy, making deals with the DUP. We also saw last year that a YouGov poll found that more people in the UK had a positive view of socialism than had a positive view of capitalism. And this is something that 30 odd years ago would have seemed ridiculous to most people, when really there was a lot of euphoria about no, but about the success of market capitalism, and now we see that starting to erode away, starting to come crashing down, I guess. And Moran Consult, which is a polling company in the US, found that Bernie Sanders, also a self-proclaimed socialist, had a 75% approval rating, which is far higher than anyone else in any other prominent leading politicians in the US. So whilst we do see that we're living in a world that is becoming increasingly dominated by very, very few media outlets and large companies, which are often in cahoots with one another, and whilst we have seen online developments that allow us to be more easily reached by targeted campaigns and things, actually we've seen the class consciousness among the working classes improving. And this because the material conditions are worsening, because people are losing, people have less stable jobs, because people don't have the money to be able to afford housing and things anymore. And over time, even once kind of all other opportunities that are kind of put upon us, we're told that we can act in a different way, such as what we've seen with the whole Brexit move. We've told that if we oppose immigration, if we keep them out, things will improve. When we've seen that actually this is a false narrative and this isn't actually going to work, we're now seeing finally some kind of backlash against this, and some kind of, well, apparently socialist movements popping up in the US and in the UK, and obviously all around the world. But US and the UK is kind of the centre of capitalism. It's quite important that this is what we're seeing here. And we've also got, possibly fading a bit, the opportunity for Catalonia to become the most developed socialist nation ever, which obviously we'll have to keep watching this, whether the working class in Catalonia can unite. We've recently seen the Prime Minister of Catalonia, Puigdemont, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Puigdemont. Yeah, retreating away and hiding in Belgium, so it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. Yeah, final conclusion. Obviously, as we're always going to argue, the need is to fight for a revolution and fight for socialism.
Right, thank you.